My son-in-law robbed me, along with his expensive lawyers, ensuring I didn't keep a single penny of my husband's money. I spent a night on the street. When I saw security guards pushing a deaf beggar, I ran over and signed, "Are they hurting you?" The man froze and suddenly, 8 black cars parked on the street. But when he revealed who he really was, everything changed. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Bernadette, and at 61 years old, I learned that everything I thought I knew about family was a lie. The call came at 3 in the morning on March 15th. Harold had collapsed at his office, they said. Heart attack. Massive. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. 42 years of marriage ended with a phone call from a stranger in scrubs who spoke in careful, practiced tones about how sorry he was for my loss. I remember sitting on the edge of our bed, still wearing Harold's old college t-shirt that I slept in, staring at the phone in my hand like it might take back the words. The house felt impossibly quiet. No more of Harold's gentle snoring, no more rustling of newspaper pages in the morning, no more off-key humming while he made his terrible coffee, just silence. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and casseroles. Our daughter Aspen stood beside me, her hand occasionally squeezing mine, but even then I could feel the distance. She kept glancing at her husband Curtis, seeking his approval for every gesture of comfort she offered me. It should have been a warning sign, but I was drowning in grief and grateful for any support. Curtis had always been smooth. When Aspen brought him home 5 years ago, Harold and I were charmed by his confidence, his ambitious talk about real estate investments and business ventures. He had this way of making you feel like you were part of something bigger, something important. Aspen glowed around him, and we thought we were watching our daughter find happiness. We were watching her disappear. 3 days after the funeral, Curtis suggested we meet to discuss practical matters. He arrived at our house on Maple Avenue with 2 men in expensive suits who introduced themselves as estate attorneys. I served coffee in my good china, the set Harold bought me for our 20th anniversary, and listened as they explained Harold's will in language that felt like it was designed to confuse rather than clarify. "Your husband was very thoughtful about protecting your future, Mrs. Brennan," the older lawyer said, shuffling through papers with practiced efficiency. "He established trusts and provisions that will ensure your comfort while also securing your daughter's inheritance." I nodded, trying to follow along. Harold had always handled our finances. I knew we were comfortable, that the house was paid off, that he had investments and life insurance. But the specific details had never been my area. That was my first mistake. "However," Curtis interjected, leaning forward with that concerned expression he'd perfected, "there are some complications we need to address. Dad made some unusual choices in his final months that could affect the estate's stability." Dad. He'd started calling Harold Dad after they married, and Harold had been pleased. Now the word felt like sandpaper against my grief. They spread documents across my dining room table, pointing to clauses and subsections that meant nothing to me. The lawyers spoke in gentle tones about tax implications and estate preservation, while Curtis nodded along like he understood every word. Aspen sat quietly beside him, occasionally glancing at me with what I thought was sympathy. "The bottom line," the younger lawyer finally said, "is that the house carries significant financial burden. The property taxes alone are nearly $8,000 annually, and there are maintenance costs, utilities, insurance. Your husband's pension and Social Security benefits will help, but they won't cover everything." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the March weather. "What are you suggesting?" Curtis reached across the table and patted my hand. "We think it would be best if you moved in with Aspen and me, at least temporarily. We have plenty of space, and this way we can take care of you properly. Meanwhile, we'll handle selling the house and managing Dad's investments." The room spun slightly. Leave the house where Harold and I had built our life together? The garden where we'd planted roses on our first anniversary? The kitchen where we'd shared 40 years of morning coffee? "I don't understand," I said, my voice smaller than I intended. "Harold always said the house was mine." that I'd never have to worry about having a roof over my head. The lawyers exchanged a look. "Mrs. Brennan, your husband did love you very much, but the reality is that estates are complicated. There are debts to consider, obligations that need to be met. The trust arrangements your husband made actually protect you from having to deal with these financial burdens directly." "Trust arrangements?" I repeated. Curtis squeezed my shoulder. "Don't worry about the details, Mom. Aspen and I will handle everything. You just need to focus on healing." Mom, another word that had once warmed my heart, but now felt like a costume he was wearing. I looked at Aspen, searching her face for some sign of doubt, some indication that this felt wrong to her too, but she was staring at her hands, lips pressed together in that way she'd done as a child when she was trying not to cry. "What about my things?" I asked. "Harold's books? Our photos? The furniture we chose together? We'll make sure everything important comes with you," Curtis assured me. "But honestly, most of this furniture is pretty old. Aspen and I can help you pick out some nice new pieces that will fit better in our guest room. Our guest room, not your room or the spare bedroom. Their guest room, where I would be a visitor in my daughter's life." The lawyers left paperwork for me to sign, documents that would transfer the house sale proceeds into trust accounts and grant Curtis power of attorney to handle Harold's business affairs. They spoke about protecting assets and ensuring my future security, but all I heard was that I was being managed, organized, filed away like one of Harold's old business contracts. That night, I sat in Harold's reading chair, surrounded by 42 years of memories. The lavender potpourri I'd always kept on the side table had faded to nothing, but I could still smell traces of Harold's cologne on the throw pillow behind my head. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked each second with mechanical precision, a sound that had always comforted me but now felt like a countdown. I found Harold's reading glasses in the pocket of his cardigan, still hanging on the back of his chair. When I held them up to the light, I could see his fingerprints on the lenses, smudged from the last time he'd cleaned them. It was such a small thing, but it broke something inside me that had been holding together through pure stubbornness. I cried until I couldn't breathe. 2 weeks later, Curtis returned with a moving truck. He'd signed the papers I'd left on the kitchen counter, he said. Everything was arranged. The house would be on the market within the month, and the trust accounts were established to handle the proceeds. "You'll thank us later," he said, supervising as strangers loaded my life into cardboard boxes. "This is really the best thing for everyone." Aspen helped me pack my clothes and a few personal items that would fit in their guest room. When I tried to take Harold's books, Curtis gently explained that they didn't have space for them, but he'd make sure they went to someone who would appreciate them. "Maybe the library," he suggested. "Dad would have liked that." I wanted to scream that Harold's name was Harold, not Dad, and that those books contained his thoughts and dreams and the marginalia of a lifetime of learning. But Aspen was crying quietly as she folded my sweaters, and I didn't want to make things harder for her. The guest room in Curtis and Aspen's house was painted a neutral beige that reminded me of doctors' offices. They'd bought me a new bed, new dresser, new everything, all of it matching and practical and completely devoid of personality. My wedding photos looked awkward on the sterile nightstand, like artifacts from someone else's life. "Isn't this nice?" Aspen said, trying to sound cheerful. "We can spend more time together now, have coffee in the mornings, watch movies." But the coffee was always Curtis's preferred brand, bitter and strong, nothing like the mild breakfast blend Harold and I had shared. And the movies were whatever Curtis wanted to watch, usually business documentaries or action films that gave me headaches. I was grateful, I told myself. My daughter was taking care of me in my time of need. This was what families did. It took me 3 months to realize I'd been stolen from. The call came from Harold's old accountant, a kind man named Walter who'd handled our taxes for 15 years. He was confused, he said. He'd received notice that someone else would be managing the estate accounts, but some numbers weren't adding up. Did I know why Harold's life insurance payout had been deposited into an account I wasn't listed on? And why the house sale proceeds weren't showing up in any of the trust accounts Curtis had mentioned? My hands shook as I wrote down the figures Walter recited. The house had sold for $850,000. Harold's life insurance was worth $600,000. His retirement accounts totaled another $950,000, plus savings, investments, and other assets. Harold had left me nearly $2.5 million. I was living in someone else's guest room, surviving on my small Social Security check, while Curtis controlled an estate worth more than most people see in a lifetime. That evening, I asked Aspen to explain the discrepancy. She looked genuinely confused, then promised to ask Curtis when he got home from his business trip. But when Curtis returned 2 days later, his explanation was smooth and rehearsed. Estate taxes, legal fees, investment strategies to protect my future. The money was safe, he assured me, working for my benefit in ways I couldn't understand. Trust me, he said, using that patronizing tone that made me feel like a confused child. This is exactly what Dad would have wanted. But I'd found something else while Curtis was away. Harold's backup will, the one he'd kept in his desk drawer at home, the copy I'd somehow missed when we packed. Curtis and his lawyers had never seen it, which meant they couldn't explain why the provisions were completely different from what they'd shown me. In Harold's real will, written in his careful handwriting just 6 months before his death, everything was left to me. Not to trusts managed by my son-in-law, not to complicated financial arrangements, but to me, Bernadette Brennan, his beloved wife of 42 years. I confronted them at dinner that night, spreading both documents across their granite kitchen table. The fake will with its complex legal language and trust arrangements, and Harold's real will with its simple, clear directive. Curtis barely glanced at the papers. Bernadette, you're confused. Estate planning is complicated, and grief can make it hard to understand these things. I understand theft, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. I understand that you used my grief and my trust to steal my husband's life's work. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. Curtis set down his fork with careful precision, and Aspen stopped breathing altogether. That's a serious accusation, Curtis said, his voice losing its warmth for the first time since Harold's death. Especially against someone who's been trying to help you. Help me? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. You've stolen nearly $2.5 million from me. You've convinced your wife that I'm too incompetent to manage my own life. You've erased every trace of my husband from existence and made me grateful for the privilege. Aspen finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Mom, Curtis wouldn't do that. He's been taking care of both of us. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw what I'd been too grieved and grateful to notice before. The tension in her shoulders, the way she glanced at Curtis before speaking, the careful control in her voice. This wasn't a woman standing by her husband. This was a woman afraid of him. Aspen, I said gently, when was the last time you made a decision without asking Curtis first? She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes filled with tears, but whether from anger or recognition, I couldn't tell. Curtis stood up, his chair scraping against the tile floor with violent emphasis. I think this conversation is over. Bernadette, you're obviously struggling with some confusion about Harold's intentions. Maybe we should look into some counseling or medication that might help with the grief. The threat was clear. Disagree with him, and I'd be labeled mentally unstable. Challenge his control, and I'd be medicated into compliance. I gathered both wills and stood up as well, my movements deliberate despite the trembling in my hands. I want my money back, all of it, and I want it within a week. Curtis smiled, the expression so cold it made my skin crawl. What money? You're living here rent-free, eating food we provide, using electricity we pay for. You have no assets, Bernadette. You have no legal standing. And you have no one else to turn to. He was right about the last part. Harold and I had lived quietly, keeping to ourselves. We had acquaintances but few close friends. No family besides Aspen. At 61, I was completely alone except for my daughter and the man who'd stolen my life. If you continue with these accusations, Curtis continued, I'll have to reconsider whether this living arrangement is working out. Aspen shouldn't have to deal with paranoid delusions on top of everything else. Aspen said nothing. She sat there staring at her untouched dinner, tears sliding down her cheeks, saying nothing. That's when I understood the true scope of what Curtis had done. He hadn't just stolen my money. He'd stolen my daughter. Slowly, carefully, over 5 years of marriage, he'd isolated her from me, made her dependent on his approval, convinced her that questioning him meant losing everything. And now he was using her love for me as leverage to ensure my silence. 3 days later, when I pressed the issue again, Curtis delivered his final ultimatum with Aspen standing silently beside him like a beautiful, broken doll. "Bernadette," he said, using my full name like a weapon. "I've spoken with our attorney. Your accusations are not only false, they're potentially actionable as defamation. If you continue spreading these lies, I'll be forced to pursue legal remedies, and given your current mental state and financial dependence, I don't think that would end well for you." He paused, letting the threat sink in. "However, I'm willing to overlook this episode if you accept that your grief has clouded your judgment and apologize for the distress you've caused Aspen." I looked at my daughter one more time, hoping for some sign that she knew what was happening, that some part of her remembered the woman who'd raised her, who'd taught her to be strong and independent, and never let anyone diminish her worth. But Aspen just stared at the floor, her hands folded in her lap like she was praying for this moment to end. "I need some air," I said. I walked outside into the April evening, the weight of betrayal settling around my shoulders like a winter coat I'd never be able to take off. Behind me, I could hear Curtis's voice through the window, low and soothing, probably explaining to Aspen how difficult it was to watch someone you care about lose their grip on reality. I had $23 in my purse and nowhere to go. As I walked into the cold night, I realized I had lost everything: my husband, my home, and now my only child. The night was colder than I expected for April, or maybe it just felt that way when you have nowhere warm to go. I walked for hours through neighborhoods that had once felt familiar, but now seemed foreign, like I was seeing them through different eyes. The eyes of someone who didn't belong anywhere. By midnight, I found myself at the downtown bus station, not because I had anywhere to go, but because it was one of the few places that stayed open all night. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting harsh shadows that made everyone look sick and desperate. Maybe we were. I sat on a metal bench that was bolted to the floor, clutching my worn leather purse against my chest like it might anchor me to reality. Inside was my driver's license, Harold's reading glasses, a small photo of Aspen as a baby, and $23 in cash. Everything else I'd owned was either stolen by Curtis or locked away in his house, where my daughter sat in silence, pretending not to know what her husband had done. The bus station attracted all kinds of people at night. Shift workers heading home from late jobs, travelers stranded between destinations, and those of us who simply had nowhere else to be. I watched them come and go, each person carrying their own story of displacement or desperation, and tried not to think about how I'd become one of them. Around 2 a.m, the exhaustion finally overtook my anger and fear. I dozed fitfully, my head against the cold brick wall, waking every few minutes when someone walked by or a bus engine roared to life. I'd never spent a night away from a proper bed, never understood what it meant to be truly homeless until I became it myself. Dawn brought no relief, just the harsh reality of a new day with nowhere to go and nothing to do with it. I used the station restroom to wash my face and try to make myself presentable, though presentable for what, I couldn't say. My reflection in the cracked mirror looked like a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale, wearing yesterday's clothes like a uniform of defeat. I spent $5 on coffee and a stale donut from the vending machine, then returned to my bench to plan my next move. Walter the accountant had given me copies of Harold's real will, but that meant nothing without money for a lawyer. Curtis controlled all the assets, and any attorney worth hiring would want payment up front. The legal aid office wouldn't open until Monday, and even then, estate disputes could take years to resolve. Years I didn't have. That's when I heard the commotion. Just outside the station's main entrance, 2 security guards were harassing a man who appeared to be homeless. From my vantage point, I could see the man was trying to communicate with them, but his gestures seemed urgent and frustrated, like someone trying to explain something important to people who weren't listening. "Move along, buddy," one of the guards said loudly. "You can't sleep here." The man gestured more frantically, pointing to something on the ground, then to his ears and mouth. The guards weren't getting it, or didn't care to try. "Look, we don't have time for this," the second guard said, grabbing the man's arm. "Either walk away or we'll call the cops." That's when I realized what was happening. The man wasn't just gesturing randomly. He was using sign language. And the guards were treating his attempts at communication like defiance. I stood up without thinking, my body moving before my brain caught up. My brother David had been born deaf, and I'd learned sign language as a child to communicate with him. We'd lost touch over the years, especially after he moved to California for work, but the language was still there, buried in my muscle memory like riding a bicycle. "Excuse me," I called out as I approached the guards. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." The guards turned to look at me, a 61-year-old woman in wrinkled clothes carrying a beat-up purse. Not exactly an intimidating presence, but they paused their harassment. I focused on the man they'd been bothering. He was probably in his late 50s, with graying hair and clothes that had seen better days, but his eyes were alert and intelligent. When he saw me approaching, something in his expression shifted from frustration to cautious hope. I raised my hands and signed slowly. "Are they hurting you? Do you need help?" The man's reaction was immediate and startling. His eyes widened, not with gratitude but with something closer to shock. He stared at me for a long moment, then signed back. "You can understand me?" His signing was fluid, practiced, the movements of someone who'd been using the language his entire life. But there was something else in his expression, a flicker of recognition that made no sense given that we'd never met. "Yes," I signed back. "What's wrong? What were you trying to tell them?" He pointed to the ground near where he'd been sitting. There was a wallet lying there, expensive leather with a corner sticking out from under a newspaper. Someone had dropped it, probably without realizing. I turned to the security guards. "He found a wallet. He was trying to turn it in, not cause trouble." The guards looked skeptical, but bent down to examine the wallet. Inside was nearly $300 in cash, along with credit cards and identification for someone named Robert Chen. "Well, I'll be damned," the first guard muttered. "Why didn't he just say that?" "He did," I replied, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "You just weren't listening." The guards took the wallet to turn in to Lost and Found, leaving me alone with the man who'd been trying to do the right thing. He was still staring at me with that odd intensity, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "Thank you," he signed. "Most people don't bother." "Most people don't know how," I signed back. "I learned from my brother." "Your brother is deaf?" "Was. He passed away 3 years ago." The lie came easily. David was actually alive and well in San Diego, but explaining our estrangement felt too complicated for a conversation with a stranger. The man nodded sympathetically, then signed, "I'm sorry for your loss. It's rare to meet someone who understands." Something about the way he phrased it made me pause. Understands what? What it's like to be invisible. To have people look right through you, or past you, like you don't matter. His words hit closer to home than he could have known. I thought about Curtis dismissing my concerns, Aspen's silence at dinner, the lawyers who'd spoken about me like I wasn't in the room. "Yes," I signed. "I understand that feeling very well." We stood there in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who'd been made invisible by circumstance and design. Then he signed, "Would you like to get some coffee?" Real coffee, not the station machine garbage. I hesitated. I barely knew this man, and my $23 wouldn't stretch to restaurant coffee. But something in his expression was kind, genuinely kind, in a way I hadn't experienced in months. "I don't really have money for," I began. "My treat," he signed, then added with a slight smile, "I insist. It's the least I can do for someone who helped me with those guards." We walked 3 blocks to a small diner that looked like it had been there since the 1950s. Red vinyl booths, checkered linoleum floors, and the smell of bacon grease and strong coffee. The kind of place Harold and I used to love for weekend breakfasts, before everything changed. The man, who'd introduced himself as Daniel through fingerspelling, ordered coffee for both of us and asked if I was hungry. My stomach answered for me with a loud growl, and he smiled, ordering us both the breakfast special. "So," he signed as we waited for our food, "what brings you to the bus station at dawn? Traveling somewhere?" I could have lied, could have made up a story about visiting relatives or taking a trip, but something about Daniel's direct, honest gaze made deception feel impossible. "I don't have anywhere to go," I signed simply. "My husband died 3 months ago, and my son-in-law stole everything. I spent last night on a bench." Daniel's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. He set it down carefully and studied my face. "Stole everything?" "Nearly $2.5 million. The house, the life insurance, retirement accounts. All of it." Signing the words made them feel more real somehow, more final. "And my daughter won't help me. She's too afraid of him." "Have you gone to the police? Reported the theft?" I shook my head. "He's too smart for that. Used lawyers, fake documents, legal language, made it all look legitimate. On paper, he's just a caring son-in-law helping his grieving mother-in-law manage complex financial matters." Daniel was quiet for a long time, his expression thoughtful. When our food arrived, he barely touched it, just continued studying me with those intelligent eyes. "What was your husband's name?" he finally asked. "Harold. Harold Brennan." I smiled despite everything. "He was a good man. Worked as an insurance adjuster for 37 years, never missed a day. Coached Little League on weekends, fixed neighbors' lawnmowers for free. The kind of person who made the world a little better just by being in it. And now his life's work is funding your son-in-law's lifestyle." Yes, the word came out bitter, angry. "Curtis is probably at a car dealership right now, picking out something expensive and unnecessary with my husband's money." Daniel reached across the table and touched my hand gently. The gesture was surprisingly warm, comforting in a way that made my eyes water. "I'm sorry," he signed. "You deserve better. Harold deserved better." "Thank you." I wiped my eyes with the paper napkin. "I'm not usually like this. I don't usually fall apart in front of strangers." "You're not falling apart. You're grieving. And you're angry. Both of those are appropriate responses to betrayal." The way he said it, with such certainty, made me wonder about his own experiences with loss and anger. But before I could ask, he was signaling the waitress for more coffee. "What will you do now?" he asked. "I don't know. Try to find a lawyer who'll work on contingency, maybe. Look for a job, though I haven't worked in 15 years. Find somewhere to sleep that isn't a bus station bench." I shrugged. "Survive, I suppose." Daniel nodded slowly, then pulled out his wallet. Not expensive like the one he'd found, but worn leather that had seen years of use. He counted out $60 and placed it on the table. "I can't accept that," I signed quickly. "You've already bought breakfast." "It's not charity," he replied. "It's an investment." "In what?" He smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him. "In the possibility that good things can happen to good people, even when everything seems hopeless." Something about the way he said it made me pause. There was weight behind those words, like he was speaking from experience. And when he stood to leave, he moved with a confidence that seemed at odds with his shabby appearance. "Will I see you again?" I asked. "I hope so," he signed. "I'll be around. I'm always around." He left me sitting in the diner with $60 I hadn't asked for, coffee I couldn't have afforded, and the strangest feeling that this encounter meant more than a simple act of kindness between strangers. I spent the rest of the day walking through the city, thinking about Daniel's words and the odd intensity in his eyes when I'd first signed to him. The way he'd reacted to my communication wasn't just gratitude, it was recognition. But recognition of what? That evening I returned to the bus station, not because I wanted to, but because I had nowhere else to go. The same bench, the same harsh lights, the same collection of displaced people seeking shelter in a place that offered none. But as I settled in for another sleepless night, I kept thinking about Daniel's parting words. "I'll be around. I'm always around." The way he stared at me wasn't gratitude, it was recognition. But recognition of what? I didn't see Daniel for 3 days after our breakfast meeting. I spent those days learning the harsh reality of homelessness in a city that wasn't designed for people like me. The $60 he'd given me stretched further than I'd expected. A night in a cheap motel, some basic toiletries, enough food to keep going. But money runs out, and by the third evening, I was back at the bus station, wondering if I'd imagined the entire encounter. Maybe Daniel had been nothing more than a kind stranger who'd briefly crossed my path. Maybe I'd been foolish to think there was something more significant about our meeting. When you're desperate, you see hope in places where none exists. I was dozing on my usual bench when someone gently touched my shoulder. I jerked awake, momentarily disoriented, then saw Daniel standing beside me, but something was different about him. He was clean-shaven, his hair neatly trimmed, and instead of the shabby clothes I'd seen him in before, he wore dark jeans and a simple gray sweater that looked expensive without being flashy. "Bernadette," he signed, his expression serious. "We need to talk." I rubbed my eyes, trying to shake off the confusion. "You look different." "Yes, there's something I need to tell you, but not here." He gestured toward the station entrance. "Can you come with me?" Every instinct told me to be cautious. I knew nothing about this man except that he'd been kind to me when kindness was rare. But what choice did I have? Stay on the bench, watching the night tick by one fluorescent flicker at a time, or follow someone who might have answers to questions I didn't even know how to ask. I gathered my purse and followed him outside, where a black sedan waited at the curb. Not flashy, not ostentatious, but clearly expensive. The kind of car that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. "This is yours?" I signed. Daniel nodded, then opened the passenger door for me. As I settled into leather seats that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check, I wondered what kind of homeless man owned a car like this. We drove in silence through downtown, past the business district where Harold used to work, up into the hills where the city lights spread below us like scattered diamonds. Daniel pulled into the circular driveway of a house that took my breath away. Not because it was ostentatious, but because it was so perfectly, quietly elegant. Prairie-style architecture with clean lines and floor-to-ceiling windows that glowed warmly in the darkness. "Daniel," I signed as we sat in the parked car. "What's going on?" He turned to face me, and in the dashboard light I could see something in his expression that looked almost like guilt. "My name isn't Daniel. Well, it is, but it's Daniel Morrison, and I'm not homeless." The words hit me like cold water. I stared at him, trying to process what he'd just told me. "Then why were you at the bus station? Why the act?" "Because sometimes you need to disappear to understand who you really are. And sometimes you need to test people to see if genuine kindness still exists in the world." He got out of the car and came around to open my door, but I remained seated, my mind spinning. Test people? Was I some kind of experiment? No. His response was immediate, emphatic. "You were never an experiment. You were proof that I was right to keep looking. Looking for what? Someone real. Someone who would help a stranger without expecting anything in return. Someone who would see a person instead of an opportunity." I followed him to the front door, my legs unsteady on the flagstone walkway. Inside, the house was even more beautiful than the exterior suggested. Not showy or pretentious, but filled with art and books and comfortable furniture that invited you to stay a while. The kind of home Harold and I had always dreamed of having when we retired. Daniel led me to a living room where a fire crackled in a stone fireplace. He gestured for me to sit on a burgundy leather sofa that was probably worth more than my car had been. "I need to explain," he signed, settling into a chair across from me. "And I need you to listen to the whole story before you decide whether to walk away." I nodded, though part of me wanted to run right then. This felt like stepping into someone else's life, someone else's reality where homeless people turned out to be wealthy and kind strangers had hidden agendas. 3 years ago, Daniel began, I was exactly what you'd expect from someone who owns a house like this. Rich, successful, surrounded by people who told me what I wanted to hear. I owned Morrison Industries. Maybe you've heard of it? I had. Morrison Industries was a manufacturing conglomerate that made everything from medical equipment to aerospace components. Harold had always spoken admiringly of their employee benefits and environmental initiatives. It was the kind of company that made products that mattered, that improved people's lives. I was married to a woman named Patricia, Daniel continued. 23 years together. We had 2 children, Rebecca and Michael. Rebecca was a doctor, brilliant and compassionate. Michael was an artist, the kind who saw beauty in places other people missed. And Patricia. He paused, his expression softening. Patricia could make anyone feel like they were the most important person in the room. I waited, sensing that the story was about to take a dark turn. They died in a car accident 2 years ago, all 3 of them coming home from Rebecca's wedding. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit them head-on. His hands moved slowly, each sign weighted with grief. I wasn't with them because I was at the office, working on some deal that seemed important at the time. Daniel, I'm so sorry. After the funeral, I discovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about my life. Patricia had been having an affair with my business partner for 5 years. My children knew about it, but had agreed to keep quiet to protect me. And my business partner had been systematically embezzling money from the company to fund his lifestyle with my wife. The cruelty of it took my breath away. To lose your family and then discover that your life had been built on lies seemed like more than any person should have to endure. The betrayal hurt more than the grief, Daniel continued. Not just Patricia's affair, but the fact that my children had felt they needed to protect me from the truth. That everyone around me had been lying, pretending, performing their roles while stealing pieces of my life. What did you do? I sold the company, liquidated everything, put the money in trusts and foundations where it could do some good. Then I disappeared. He gestured around the room. This house belonged to my grandfather. It's the only property I kept because it holds memories from before everything went wrong. But why the Homeless Act? Why pretend? Daniel stood and walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames. Because I wanted to know if there were any genuinely good people left in the world. People who would help someone who couldn't help them back, who had nothing to offer in return. I've spent the last year living on the streets, testing humanity. And what did you find? Mostly what you'd expect. People who walked past, people who were cruel, people who pretended not to see. But occasionally, he turned back to me, his expression brightening. Occasionally, I found someone like you. I felt my cheeks flush. I didn't do anything special. I just translated what you were trying to tell those guards. You saw a person in distress and you helped. No hesitation, no calculation of what you might gain. You were homeless yourself, carrying everything you owned in a beat-up purse. And you still stopped to help a stranger. Do you have any idea how rare that is? I thought about Curtis, about how he'd calculated every interaction for maximum personal benefit. About Aspen, who'd stopped trusting her own judgment because questioning Curtis's motives was too dangerous. About the lawyers who'd stolen from me while wearing sympathetic expressions. Maybe rarer than I thought, I admitted. Daniel returned to his chair, leaning forward with an intensity that made me pay closer attention. Bernadette, I want to help you get your life back, not as charity, but as partnership. You've shown me that decent people still exist. Let me show you that justice is still possible. I don't understand. I still have resources, legal connections, investigative contacts, financial leverage. Curtis thinks he's untouchable because he's covered his tracks with lawyers and paperwork. But there's always a way to expose the truth if you know where to look. I stared at him, trying to process what he was offering. Why would you do that? You don't know me. I know enough. I know you helped a stranger when you had every reason to focus on your own problems. I know you loved your husband enough to fight for his legacy even when it seemed hopeless. I know you're stronger than Curtis thinks you are. And if we can't prove what he did, if his lawyers are too good, his paperwork too convincing, Daniel smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. Then Curtis has never dealt with someone who has $47 million and nothing left to lose. The number hit me like a physical blow. $47 million. The kind of wealth that could move mountains, topple governments, certainly expose one greedy son-in-law's theft. You're serious about this, I said. Deadly serious. But I need you to understand something first. His expression grew solemn. This won't be gentle. When we go after Curtis, it won't be enough to just get your money back. He needs to face consequences for what he's done. Not just to you, but to Aspen. He's stolen her agency, her independence, her ability to trust her own judgment. That's abuse, and it needs to stop. I thought about my daughter's silence at dinner, the way she'd looked at her hands instead of defending me, the careful way she'd spoken, always checking Curtis's reaction before expressing any opinion of her own. What about Aspen? If we destroy Curtis, what happens to her? She gets her life back. It might hurt at first, but eventually she'll understand that we gave her the greatest gift possible, the truth. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where my old life had died and my new one was being born. Somewhere down there, Curtis was sleeping peacefully in a house bought with Harold's money, confident that I would never have the resources to challenge him. Aspen was probably lying awake beside him, trapped in a marriage built on lies and control. If I agree to this, I said, there's no going back. Curtis will fight dirty. He'll try to turn Aspen against me completely. Yes, Daniel agreed. He will. The question is, are you willing to risk losing your daughter temporarily in order to save her permanently? I closed my eyes and thought about Harold, about the life we'd built together through honest work and genuine love, about the future he'd tried to secure for me, stolen by someone who saw kindness as weakness and trust as opportunity. When I opened my eyes, Daniel was watching me with patient understanding. What do we do first? I asked. His smile was fierce, predatory in a way that should have scared me but instead filled me with hope. First, we gather evidence. Then we give Curtis a choice: return what he's stolen voluntarily, or have it taken from him by force. And if he chooses to fight, then we destroy him so thoroughly that Aspen will finally see who she really married. I should have been shocked by the cold calculation in his voice. Instead, I felt a surge of satisfaction that someone finally understood the scope of what Curtis had done and was willing to match his cruelty with superior force. There's one more thing, Daniel said. Once we start this, you can't stay at shelters or bus stations anymore. Curtis might have people watching for you, and we need you safe while we work. I can't afford, you'll stay here. There are 4 guest bedrooms, and I could use the company. His expression softened. This house has been empty too long. It needs laughter, conversation, life. It needs someone who understands what it's like to lose everything and find the strength to rebuild. I looked around the beautiful room, at the books and art and comfortable furniture, and imagined what it would be like to live somewhere warm and safe while planning Curtis's downfall. To have hot meals and soft beds and someone who believed in my fight for justice. Why are you really doing this? I asked. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally answered, his voice was gentle but determined. Because Curtis represents everything I've come to hate about people with power. The casual cruelty, the assumption that money makes you superior, the belief that you can destroy someone's life without consequences, and you represent everything I'd hoped still existed: dignity in the face of loss, kindness without expectation of reward, the refusal to surrender even when everything seems hopeless. He turned to meet my eyes. I thought I'd lost everything when my family died, but losing everything taught me what really matters. Now I want to help you find that same clarity. And if we succeed, if we get my money back and expose what Curtis did, then you'll have the resources to rebuild your life however you want it. And I'll know that justice is still possible in a world that often feels hopeless. I nodded slowly, feeling something I hadn't experienced in months, the stirring of hope. Not the desperate hope of someone with no options, but the confident hope of someone who finally had allies and resources and a plan for victory. When do we start? I asked. Daniel's smile was answer enough. I thought I'd lost everything. I never imagined I'd find someone who'd lost even more. Living in Daniel's house felt surreal for the first week. I'd wake up in a guest bedroom larger than the entire apartment Harold and I had shared when we were first married, surrounded by Egyptian cotton sheets and furniture that belonged in magazines. The view from my window overlooked the city where I'd spent 3 nights sleeping on benches, and the contrast was almost too much to process. Daniel had given me space to adjust, but also made it clear that this wasn't charity. Every morning, we met in his study to plan our next move against Curtis. The room was lined floor to ceiling with law books, financial texts, and investigative resources that made it clear Daniel had been preparing for this kind of battle long before we met. The key to exposing Curtis, he explained on our 4th day, is understanding that men like him always make the same mistakes. They get greedy, they get careless, and they underestimate the people they've wronged. He'd hired a team of investigators, the kind of professionals who specialized in uncovering financial fraud and corporate malfeasance. They worked quietly, methodically, following paper trails and digital footprints that Curtis thought he'd erased. The first breakthrough came on Tuesday morning. Daniel's lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Walsh, arrived with a thick folder and a satisfied expression. "Your son-in-law is not as clever as he thinks," she announced, spreading documents across Daniel's mahogany desk. "We've found 3 separate bank accounts he opened using your husband's social security number and forged signatures. The money trail is quite clear once you know where to look. I studied the papers, seeing Harold's name on documents he'd never signed, authorizing transfers he'd never approved. The scope of Curtis's deception was breathtaking. He'd been planning this theft for months before Harold died, setting up the infrastructure to steal everything the moment I was too grieved to pay attention. This is enough to file criminal charges," Catherine continued. "Bank fraud, identity theft, elder abuse. He's looking at serious prison time." "What about the lawyers who helped him?" I asked. "They had to know these documents were fake." Daniel's expression darkened. "That's where it gets interesting. We've discovered that Curtis has been paying his legal team from your husband's estate. He's literally using your money to pay the people helping him steal from you." The audacity of it left me speechless. Curtis hadn't just stolen my inheritance, he'd made me pay for the privilege of being robbed. "There's more," Catherine said, pulling out another set of documents. "Your daughter's finances are completely controlled by Curtis. He's the sole signatory on all their accounts, credit cards, investments. She can't access money without his approval, and he's been using her name on loan applications without her knowledge." I thought about Aspen's quiet desperation, the way she'd seemed to shrink into herself over the years of her marriage. I'd attributed it to normal marital adjustment, but now I saw it for what it really was: financial abuse designed to ensure her complete dependence. "He's trapped her," I whispered. "Completely," Daniel agreed. "Even if she wanted to leave him, she has no access to money, no credit in her own name, no way to support herself independently. It's a classic pattern of financial control." That afternoon, Daniel and I drove to the courthouse to file the criminal complaints. Watching the clerk stamp and process the paperwork felt like the first time in months that I'd taken action, rather than simply enduring whatever Curtis chose to do to me. But Daniel wasn't content with just legal proceedings. "Criminal cases can take years," he explained as we sat in his car outside the courthouse. "Curtis will use every delay tactic his lawyers can think of. Meanwhile, he's still controlling Aspen and spending your money. We need to force his hand. What do you have in mind?" "We're going to make him an offer he can't refuse. Return everything he's stolen, plus interest for the damages he's caused, and we'll consider settling quietly. Refuse, and we'll take this public in ways that will destroy not just his finances but his reputation." "You think he'll agree to that?" Daniel's smile was cold as winter. "No, men like Curtis never voluntarily give up power. But his refusal will give us everything we need to justify what comes next." The confrontation was scheduled for Friday afternoon at Daniel's lawyer's office. Curtis arrived with 2 attorneys and an expression of supreme confidence that evaporated the moment he saw me sitting beside Daniel at the conference table. "What is this?" Curtis demanded, his smooth charm nowhere in evidence. "Bernadette, what are you doing here, and who is this man?" "My name is Daniel Morrison," Daniel replied calmly, "and I'm here because Bernadette asked for my help recovering the assets you've stolen from her." Curtis's lawyers immediately went into damage control mode, insisting that all estate matters had been handled legally and appropriately. But I could see the panic starting to creep into Curtis's expression as Daniel's attorney laid out the evidence piece by piece: the forged signatures, the fake bank accounts, the unauthorized transfers, the legal fees paid from my husband's estate to fund Curtis's theft. Each revelation hit Curtis like a physical blow, and by the time they finished presenting the evidence, his face was ashen. "This is all circumstantial," one of Curtis's lawyers insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Daniel asked pleasantly. "Catherine, would you mind playing the recording?" The investigator pressed play on a small device, and Curtis's voice filled the conference room. He was talking to someone, his other lawyer, based on the content, discussing how to manage Bernadette's expectations and ensure she didn't cause problems with the estate arrangements. "The old woman doesn't understand finance," Curtis's recorded voice said with casual contempt. "She'll sign whatever we put in front of her as long as we frame it properly." Harold was the same way, too trusting for his own good. I watched my son-in-law's face crumble as his own words played back, revealing his true opinion of the people he'd claimed to care about. The man who'd called Harold Dad had viewed him as nothing more than a mark to be exploited. "We also have video footage of you entering several banks with forged documents," Catherine added helpfully. "Amazing what security cameras capture these days." Curtis's lawyers were whispering urgently in his ears, but I could see from his expression that he knew the game was over. The evidence was overwhelming, damning, impossible to explain away. "What do you want?" Curtis asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Daniel leaned forward, his tone conversational, but his words cutting. "Full restitution. Every penny you've stolen, plus 3% annual interest for damages. Transfer of the house back to Bernadette's name. Resignation from any role in managing Harold's estate. And a formal apology acknowledging what you've done. And if I refuse, then we file criminal charges tomorrow. Bank fraud alone carries up to 30 years in federal prison. Add in elder abuse, identity theft, and conspiracy, and you'll be an old man before you see the outside of a prison cell again." Curtis looked to his lawyers for support, but they were already distancing themselves, making notes about withdrawing from representation and protecting their own interests. "I need time to consider," Curtis began. "No," Daniel interrupted. "You've had months to do the right thing. You get 5 minutes to decide whether you want to resolve this quietly or face the full consequences of your actions." The 5 minutes felt like an hour. Curtis sat hunched over, his lawyers offering whispered advice that he seemed unable to process. Finally, he looked up with the expression of a man who'd just realized his life was over. "How do I know you won't pursue criminal charges even if I agree?" "Because unlike you," I said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began, "we keep our word. Return what you've stolen and we'll consider the matter resolved. But if you ever try to control or manipulate Aspen again, if you ever prevent her from having a relationship with me, we'll revisit these criminal charges." Curtis nodded slowly, defeat written across his features. "What about Aspen?" "What do I tell her?" "You tell her the truth," Daniel said. "That you've been stealing from her mother and controlling her finances without her knowledge. That you've systematically isolated her from her family while using her husband's money to fund your lifestyle. You tell her exactly who you are. She'll leave me." "Yes," I agreed. "She probably will. And that will be the first honest thing to happen in your marriage." The paperwork took 3 hours to complete. Bank transfers, property deeds, legal waivers, and documents that would restore my access to everything Harold had left me. By the time we finished, Curtis looked like he'd aged 10 years. As his lawyers packed up their materials, Curtis turned to me one last time. "You know she won't forgive you for this, Aspen. She'll blame you for destroying her marriage." "Maybe," I replied, "but at least she'll be free to make that choice for herself." After Curtis left, his shoulders bowed with defeat. Daniel and I sat in the conference room surrounded by the detritus of legal battle. I should have felt victorious, but instead I felt hollow, exhausted by the necessity of destroying someone to protect myself and my daughter. Are you having second thoughts? Daniel asked gently. I considered the question seriously. Curtis was Aspen's husband, the father of any children she might have. Destroying him would cause her pain, at least initially. But leaving him in power would have destroyed her slowly, year by year, until she forgot she'd ever been strong enough to make her own decisions. No, I said finally. He made his choices. Now Aspen gets to make hers. Daniel nodded approvingly. The hardest part is over. Now we see if your daughter is ready to reclaim her life. That evening, as I sat in Daniel's living room with Harold's reading glasses in my lap and 47 years of marriage photos spread across the coffee table, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago, grieving, trusting, grateful for whatever scraps of kindness Curtis chose to offer. That woman wouldn't have recognized the person I'd become. Harder, certainly, but also stronger. More clear-eyed about human nature and the price of naive trust. Tomorrow, Curtis would have to face Aspen and explain what he'd done. She would have to choose between the comfortable prison of her marriage and the uncertain freedom of independence. And I would have to live with the consequences of forcing that choice upon her. But tonight, for the first time since Harold died, I felt like I was fighting for something, rather than just surviving each day. Curtis had no idea what was coming, neither did Aspen, but after tomorrow everything would change. The call came at 7:30 the next morning. I was sitting in Daniel's kitchen, nursing my second cup of coffee and trying to prepare myself for whatever aftermath would follow yesterday's confrontation. When my phone rang and I saw Aspen's name, my heart stopped for a moment. Mom? Her voice was shaky, uncertain, Curtis told me. He said there were some legal issues, some misunderstanding about Dad's estate. Can we talk? Some misunderstanding. Even facing complete exposure, Curtis couldn't bring himself to tell the truth directly. Of course, sweetheart. Where would you like to meet? Could you come here? To the house? Curtis is. He's not feeling well today. He's staying home from work. I'll bet he isn't feeling well, I thought. Having your life's work exposed as systematic theft would certainly affect anyone's health. I'll be there in an hour, I told her. Daniel offered to drive me, but I declined. This conversation needed to happen between mother and daughter without the intimidating presence of the man who'd helped orchestrate Curtis's downfall. Whatever came next had to be Aspen's choice, made freely and without pressure from either side. The drive to Oak Ridge Drive felt surreal. 6 months ago, I'd made this same journey as a homeless woman with $23 and nowhere else to go. Today, I drove my own car, Harold's old Honda, retrieved from the impound lot where Curtis had abandoned it, wearing clothes I'd bought with my own restored money, carrying legal documents that proved my vindication. The house looked exactly the same from the outside. Perfect lawn, perfect landscaping, perfect facade hiding the rot within. I sat in the driveway for a few minutes, gathering my courage. No matter how this conversation went, it would change everything between Aspen and me. Either we'd finally be honest with each other, or we'd lose whatever fragile connection we still had. Aspen answered the door before I could knock. She looked terrible, pale, hollow-eyed, like she hadn't slept. Her usually perfect hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore wrinkled clothes that suggested she'd been up all night. "Mom?" she said, and threw her arms around me. I held her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of her shampoo, feeling how thin she'd gotten. When had my daughter become so fragile? When had I stopped noticing that she was disappearing inside her own life? "Come in," she whispered against my shoulder. "We need to talk." Curtis was nowhere to be seen as Aspen led me to their living room. The space was still as cold and impersonal as I remembered, expensive furniture arranged for show rather than comfort, no family photos or personal touches that might suggest actual people lived here. We sat across from each other on opposite ends of their pristine white sofa, and for a moment neither of us spoke. Aspen twisted her wedding ring around her finger, a nervous habit she'd developed as a child whenever she was anxious. "Curtis told me some things last night," she finally said. "About the legal settlement. About Dad's money." "What did he tell you?" Aspen's voice was barely above a whisper. "He said you hired lawyers to challenge the estate arrangements. that you made accusations about him stealing money. He said it was all a misunderstanding, that you were confused about the legal complexities, but that he agreed to settle rather than put you through a long court battle. I felt my jaw tighten. Even in confession, Curtis couldn't resist painting himself as the generous victim. "And what do you think about that?" I asked carefully. Aspen looked up at me, tears brimming in her eyes. "I think my husband has been lying to me for months, maybe years." The admission hung between us like a confession of sin. Aspen had always been proud of her ability to read people, to see through facades and manipulation. Admitting that Curtis had fooled her was like admitting she'd lost faith in her own judgment. "What makes you think that?" I asked gently. "The phone calls, late-night conversations he thought I couldn't hear, meetings with lawyers that he said were about his business deals, and—" she paused, struggling with the words. "The money. We live in this house, drive expensive cars, take vacations I know his salary can't afford. When I asked him about it, he said he was good at investing, that Dad had left detailed financial instructions about growing the estate, but you never saw any of those instructions. No. Curtis said they were too complicated for me to understand, that I should focus on our family while he handled the business details." Aspen laughed bitterly. "I was so grateful to not have to worry about money that I never questioned where it was coming from." I reached across the space between us and took her hand. "Tell me what happened last night." Aspen closed her eyes, her voice breaking as she continued. "He came home from his meeting looking like he'd seen a ghost. He went straight to his office and started making phone calls, angry calls where he kept saying things like, 'This can't happen,' and 'find another way.' Then he came upstairs and told me we needed to talk. And he said you'd been working with some rich man to make trouble for us, that this man had convinced you that Curtis had done something wrong with Dad's money, and that they were threatening legal action unless Curtis agreed to pay you off." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "But Mom," the way he said it, he wasn't angry about false accusations. He was angry about getting caught. The truth was finally breaking through the carefully constructed lies Curtis had built around their marriage. I squeezed Aspen's hand, encouraging her to continue. I started asking questions. Real questions, not the gentle ones I'd learned to ask to avoid upsetting him. I asked to see the financial documents, the investment records, proof of where our money was really coming from. Aspen's voice hardened. He refused. Said I was being hysterical, that I was letting you poison me against him. And that's when I knew. Knew what? That you'd never tried to poison me against anyone. You'd barely spoken to me in months, barely fought for yourself even when you should have. But Curtis had been working very hard to make sure I never questioned him about anything. I felt a surge of pride mixed with heartbreak. My daughter was stronger than Curtis had given her credit for, but it had taken her so long to trust her own instincts again. "What did you do?" I waited until he fell asleep. Then I went to his office. The financial files, he said, were too complicated for me to understand. Aspen's voice turned bitter. They weren't complicated at all. They were bank statements showing transfers from accounts in Dad's name, investment records showing Curtis liquidating Dad's retirement funds, legal bills paid from Dad's estate to cover the cost of stealing from you. The magnitude of Curtis's betrayal was finally hitting her. Not just the theft, but the systematic way he'd conditioned her to stop asking questions, stop trusting her own judgment, stop believing she was capable of understanding her own life. "He stole everything," she whispered, "and he made me complicit by keeping me ignorant." "Where is Curtis now?" "Upstairs, packing." Aspen's voice was hollow. "I told him to leave. He kept trying to explain, trying to convince me that what he did was justified because you didn't understand finance, because Dad would have wanted him to protect the money from your poor decisions. Even facing complete exposure, he still couldn't admit that what he did was wrong." I thought about Curtis's arrogance, his absolute certainty that he was entitled to make decisions for other people. Even losing everything wouldn't change his fundamental belief that he was superior to the women whose lives he'd controlled. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "I know this hurts." Aspen shook her head. "Don't apologize. You saved me. If you hadn't fought back, I might have spent the rest of my life living a lie. raising children with a man who saw me as property to be managed rather than a person to be respected. What will you do now? I don't know. Aspen wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I haven't had to make my own decisions in so long. I'm not sure I remember how. Curtis controlled everything. Where we lived, how we spent money, who we socialized with, even what I wore to important events. I felt like I was slowly disappearing, but I told myself it was normal, that marriage meant compromise. It doesn't mean surrendering your identity. No, but it took losing you to make me realize what I'd given up. Aspen met my eyes directly for the first time since I'd arrived. I'm sorry, Mom, for choosing him over you, for not defending you, for letting him convince me that you were the problem. I was so afraid of losing my marriage that I was willing to sacrifice my relationship with my mother. The apology I'd been waiting months to hear finally came, and it meant everything. Not because I needed Aspen's acknowledgement of my pain, but because her ability to see clearly again meant she could rebuild her life on truth rather than illusion. You don't need to apologize for being manipulated by an expert manipulator, I told her. Curtis spent years conditioning you to doubt yourself. Breaking free from that kind of psychological control takes enormous courage. I don't feel courageous. I feel stupid. You feel human, and human beings sometimes trust the wrong people, especially when those people work very hard to seem trustworthy. We sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both of us processing the wreckage of our relationship with Curtis and the possibility of rebuilding something honest between us. Mom, Aspen said finally, who was the man who helped you? Curtis kept referring to him as your rich friend, but he seemed really angry about whoever it was. I told her about Daniel, about our meeting at the bus station and his decision to help me fight for justice. I explained his background, his own experiences with betrayal and loss, the resources he'd been willing to invest in exposing Curtis's crimes. He sounds like a good man, Aspen said when I finished. He is, and he understands what it's like to lose everything and find the strength to rebuild. Is that what we're doing? Rebuilding? I looked around Curtis's house with its expensive emptiness and complete lack of warmth. Do you want to rebuild? Aspen followed my gaze, taking in the sterile perfection that had been her prison for 5 years. Yes, but not here. This place never felt like home anyway. It felt like a museum where I was just another display piece. Footsteps on the stairs interrupted our conversation. Curtis appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 suitcases and wearing the expression of a man who'd lost a war he'd been certain he would win. He looked between Aspen and me, his face cycling through anger, desperation, and finally a cold calculation that made my skin crawl. Aspen, he said, his voice taking on the honey-sweet tone he'd always used to manipulate her. You don't have to do this. We can work through this misunderstanding. Your mother has turned you against me, but we can fix our marriage if you're willing to try. Aspen stood up slowly, her posture straightening as she found her courage. There's nothing to fix, Curtis. There never was a real marriage to begin with. Just you controlling me while you stole from my mother. I protected you from having to worry about complex financial matters. You stole $2.5 million. Aspen cut him off, her voice stronger than I'd heard it in years. You forged my father's signature, opened bank accounts in his name, and used his death as an opportunity to rob his widow. Nothing you say can change those facts. Curtis's mask finally slipped completely. Fine. But you'll regret this, both of you. You think you're so much better than me, but you're nothing without me. Aspen, you haven't worked in 5 years. You have no credit, no savings, no skills that any employer would value. You'll come crawling back within 6 months. No, Aspen said with quiet certainty. I won't. Curtis turned his venom toward me. And you, Bernadette. You think your rich friend will keep protecting you forever? Men like him don't help people out of kindness. He wants something from you, and when he gets it, you'll be alone again. Maybe, I replied calmly. But I'd rather be alone with my integrity than married to someone who sees me as property. Curtis grabbed his suitcases and headed for the door, but paused at the threshold for one final attack. You've destroyed this family, he spat, I hope you're satisfied." Aspen walked past him to open the front door wider. "No, Curtis, you destroyed it. We're just cleaning up the wreckage." After he left, Aspen and I stood in the sudden quiet of the house, listening to his car pull out of the driveway and disappear down Oak Ridge Drive. "It's over," Aspen said wonderingly, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "The lying is over," I agreed. "But everything else is just beginning." My daughter stood between her old life and the truth, and for the first time, I wasn't sure which she'd choose. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, watching Aspen plant tomatoes in the garden Harold and I had dreamed of having someday. The house wasn't large or pretentious, a comfortable craftsman bungalow on the outskirts of town with enough land for vegetables and flowers and the kind of quiet that lets you think clearly. Aspen had moved in with me 2 weeks after Curtis left, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because we both needed to learn how to be family again. The guest room she'd chosen overlooked the garden, and she'd painted it soft yellow, the color of hope and new beginnings. "The basil is coming up beautifully," she called through the open window. "And I think the pepper plants are going to produce enough for us to can some salsa this fall." I smiled, remembering how Curtis had sneered at the idea of Aspen having dirty fingernails or learning practical skills like gardening and cooking. He'd preferred her ornamental, decorative, safely contained within the narrow boundaries of his vision for the perfect wife. The woman in my garden bore little resemblance to that carefully controlled person. Aspen's hair was shorter now, easier to manage, and she wore jeans and old sweaters instead of the designer clothes Curtis had selected for her. She looked younger, healthier, more like the daughter I remembered from before her marriage. The financial settlement had been completed without further drama. Curtis had transferred every penny back, plus the 3% annual interest Daniel had demanded. The house on Oak Ridge Drive had been sold, with Aspen's share going into an account in her name alone. Money Curtis couldn't touch, control, or even monitor. More importantly, the criminal charges had been dropped as agreed, but not before Curtis's theft had been thoroughly documented and reported to the State Bar Association. His law license was under review, and 2 of the attorneys who'd helped him faced their own disciplinary proceedings. Justice, as Daniel had promised, was sometimes slow, but ultimately thorough. Curtis himself had disappeared, rumor suggested to another state where his reputation hadn't yet caught up with him. Aspen had received divorce papers through the mail, which she'd signed without hesitation or regret. "I should have done it years ago," she'd told me as she mailed back the signed documents. "I just needed to remember who I was before he convinced me I was nothing without him." The process of rebuilding trust between us had been gradual, sometimes difficult. Years of manipulation had left Aspen uncertain about her own judgment, and years of being dismissed had left me protective of my independence. But slowly, conversation by conversation, we'd learned to be honest with each other again. The turning point had come one evening in July when Aspen found me crying over a photo album filled with pictures of Harold. Instead of offering platitudes or trying to fix my grief, she'd simply sat beside me and cried too. Not just for the grandfather she'd barely known, but for all the time Curtis had stolen from our family. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me most," she'd whispered. "I'm sorry I let him convince me that your grief was weakness, and his control was strength." "You're here now," I'd replied. "That's what matters." Daniel had become a regular presence in our lives, though not in the way Curtis had predicted. There was no hidden agenda, no expectation of payment for his help. He simply understood what it meant to rebuild after betrayal, and he offered the kind of friendship that comes from shared experience with loss and recovery. He'd started coming for dinner once a week, usually bringing ingredients for elaborate meals that taught Aspen and me new cooking techniques. The house filled with laughter and conversation in ways it never had when I'd lived alone, or when Aspen had been trapped in her sterile marriage. "You know," Aspen said one evening as we cleaned up after one of Daniel's cooking lessons, "I think Dad would have liked him." She was right. Harold had always been drawn to people with quiet integrity, those who did the right thing without needing recognition or reward. Daniel's decision to help a stranger seek justice would have earned Harold's immediate respect and friendship. This morning, Aspen was particularly excited about the garden because Daniel was coming for lunch, and she wanted to show off the vegetables that were finally ready for harvest. At 33, she was learning to take pride in small accomplishments, personal achievements that belonged to her alone. The doorbell rang at exactly noon, punctual as always. I opened the door to find Daniel carrying a bottle of wine and a bouquet of sunflowers from his own garden. "How's the patient?" he asked, referring to Aspen's recent bout with a summer cold that had kept her home from her new job for 3 days. "Fully recovered and eager to show off her agricultural prowess," I replied, leading him through the house to the backyard. Aspen had indeed recovered, blooming with health and confidence in ways that would have been impossible during her marriage. She'd found work at a local nonprofit that helped women transition out of abusive relationships, using her own experience to guide others toward independence and safety. "It's strange," she'd told me after her first week at the job. "For so long, I thought my experience with Curtis was just a failed marriage, personal weakness on my part. But when I heard other women's stories, I realized that what he did was textbook financial and emotional abuse. Recognizing that pattern helped me understand that I wasn't weak, I was systematically undermined." The work was demanding but fulfilling, giving Aspen a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life as Curtis's decorative wife. More importantly, it was hers, a career she'd chosen based on her own interests and values, not something selected for her by someone who saw her as an extension of himself. Over lunch, we talked about Aspen's latest clients, Daniel's foundation work, and my own tentative plans to volunteer at the local literacy center. At 62, I was discovering interests and abilities that had been dormant during my years as Harold's wife and Curtis's victim. "You know what I realized yesterday?" Aspen said as we finished our meal. "For the first time in years, I made it through an entire day without wondering if someone would approve of my choices. I picked my own clothes, ordered my own lunch, decided how to prioritize my work tasks, all without seeking permission or second-guessing myself." "How did it feel?" Daniel asked. "Terrifying at first, then liberating, then normal, the way it should have been all along." This was the gift Daniel had given us both. Not just the money and legal resources to fight Curtis, but the reminder that justice was possible and that people could choose truth over comfortable lies. As the afternoon wore on, Aspen excused herself to take a nap, still recovering her energy after being sick. Daniel and I moved to the front porch, where we could watch the neighborhood children playing in the street and enjoy the late summer breeze. "Any regrets?" Daniel asked, the question he'd posed periodically over the past months. "About Curtis? No. About the years it took me to fight back? Sometimes." I considered the question seriously. "What about you? Any regrets about helping a stranger who turned your quiet life upside down?" Daniel smiled, the expression transforming his face in the way that always reminded me why Harold would have liked him. "My life was too quiet. I needed the reminder that good things could happen when good people work together. And now? Now I remember why it's worth trying to make the world a little better, one injustice at a time." We sat in comfortable silence, two people who'd found friendship in the ruins of our separate tragedies. Neither of us was looking for romance or the complications of rebuilding lives already shadowed by loss. Instead, we'd discovered something rarer and perhaps more valuable: the companionship of shared understanding. "Daniel," I said as the sun began to set behind the mountains, "what you did for us, there's no way to repay that kind of generosity." "You already have repaid it," he replied. "You reminded me that there are people worth fighting for, causes worth investing in, and that sometimes justice really does prevail when good people refuse to give up." "Is that enough? For someone who's lost as much as you have?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching the children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. When he finally answered, his voice was thoughtful but certain. "I spent a year living on the streets, testing whether humanity was worth saving. I met dozens of people, some kind, some cruel, most just indifferent. But you were the first person who saw someone in distress and acted without calculation, without wondering what you might gain or lose." He turned to meet my eyes directly, That moment when you intervened with those security guards, when you treated me like a person worth defending. That's when I knew the world still contained people like my Rebecca would have been if she'd lived longer. Like my Patricia could have been if she'd chosen honesty over deception. You gave us our lives back. You gave me hope back. That's a fair trade. As evening settled over our quiet street, Aspen emerged from the house carrying 3 glasses of iced tea and the photo album I'd been avoiding for months. She set the drinks on the porch table, then settled into the chair beside mine. "I found these when I was looking for something else," she said, opening the album to pages filled with pictures of Harold. "I thought it might be time to remember him properly, without all the grief and anger Curtis left us with." We looked through the photos together, Harold teaching a young Aspen to ride a bicycle, Harold and me dancing at our 25th anniversary party, Harold reading in his favorite chair with his glasses sliding down his nose, pictures of a good man who'd worked hard, loved well, and deserved to be remembered with joy rather than sorrow. "He would have been so proud of you," I told Aspen as we lingered over a photo of her college graduation, Harold beaming beside her in his ill-fitting suit, standing up to Curtis, building a new life, helping other women find their strength. This is exactly who he hoped you'd become. "And he would have been grateful to you," Aspen said to Daniel, "for making sure his sacrifice meant something, that the life he built for us wasn't stolen permanently." Daniel studied the photos with the careful attention of someone who understood the weight of memory. "He looks like a man who understood what really mattered." "He did," I agreed. "Family, honesty, hard work, treating people with dignity. Simple values, but not always easy ones. The best values never are." As the stars came out, we talked about Harold and the life he'd built for us, the legacy Curtis had tried to steal, and the future we were creating from the ashes of his deception. It was the kind of conversation Harold would have loved. Honest, thoughtful, filled with people who cared more about doing right than appearing impressive. By 10 o'clock, Daniel was gathering his things to leave, but he paused at the porch steps for one final observation. "You know what strikes me most about this whole experience?" he said. Curtis thought he was so clever, manipulating 2 women he considered weak and naive. But in the end, his victims turned out to be stronger than his lies, and his assumption of superiority became his downfall. "Poetic justice," Aspen observed. "The best kind," I agreed. After Daniel left, Aspen and I sat on the porch a little longer, listening to the night sounds of our peaceful neighborhood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions to make independently, new opportunities to choose courage over comfort. But tonight, we were simply a mother and daughter who'd survived betrayal and found each other again. We were women who'd learned that family isn't about blood or obligation, but about choosing to support each other's growth and freedom. And we were proof that sometimes, when everything seems lost, the most powerful response is not anger or revenge, but the quiet determination to rebuild something better from the ruins. "Mom," Aspen said as we finally went inside, "thank you for never giving up. On me, on yourself, on the possibility that things could get better. Thank you for finding your way back to yourself, and for choosing truth over comfort." We locked the doors and turned out the lights, secure in our small house filled with honest relationships and possibilities for tomorrow. Outside, the garden grew in the darkness, tended by our own hands, rooted in soil that belonged to us. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you really need. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.